Ready?
Let's call the Community Finance Committee meeting to order on June 28th, 2023. Have a roll call, please.
Mr. Kowski,
Here.
Mr. Davis,
Here.
Dr. Fioraza, Ms. Guerrero, Mr. Einhorn.
He's muted.
Dr. Johnson,
Yes. Here.
Mr. Kohler,
Here.
Mr. Miller,
Here.
Dr. O'Dell, Dr. Sanders, Ms. Sador.
Thank you, Lisa. Hopefully everyone had a chance to review the minutes from our last meeting on May 15th. Any questions or concerns on the minutes? If not, I have a motion, please. To approve. Second.
Yeah.
All in favor? Aye. Thank you. We have no one in the audience. Do we have anyone on Zoom for public comment?
Just one to be read into the minutes.
Then our first discussion item is the preliminary budget. So we read on it, Ryan?
So actually, Brian, we had a little short staff in our department, and Brian has put together the budget and also the presentation for tonight. Are we able to project it?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm bringing it up now.
I think just here would be
Here would be
sufficient.
like that,
Okay.
just so we can all see it. Thank you.
You guys want me to share the presentation on my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. That will benefit our Zoom audience.
All right, how's that looking on your guys' end?
Looks good.
Okay.
Give us just 1 second for our screen to come up here. There we go, we're good.
Okay, so tonight we've got a presentation on the preliminary budget. And one thing I like to mention up front is that while tonight's presentation is the first public showing of the budget, it's really just one milestone within a pretty lengthy process. Budget prep usually begins for us internally in January and then concludes in September with the board's formal adoption. And of course, there are several revisions made along the way during that time frame. So tonight's meeting is really meant to kind of kick off the dialogue publicly and provide a sense of where we're heading. So, the committee's questions and feedback are welcome throughout the presentation. And I'll stop at various points along the way just to kind of see if there are any questions out there, but feel free to jump in if you have comments or questions. Okay, so moving into the presentation, this slide is a quick recap of our budgeting methodology. From an expenditure standpoint, we use a zero-based budgeting method, which essentially means we are building the budget from scratch each year. So salaries and benefits are budgeted by individual employee. Capital budgets are developed from existing contracts or cost estimates if the project hasn't gone out to bid yet. And then all other expenditure amounts come from itemized requests prepared by our various budget managers. On the revenue side, sources remain fairly similar from year to year. So that area of the budget is typically built using historical trends. And then we make adjustments made for current economic conditions or other industry related information that's relevant to the upcoming year. All right, so then jumping into some actual budget data, we're going to start with the revenue side of the ledger. As we all know, property taxes are the largest source of revenue for the district. Fiscal year 24's revenues are driven by the levy that was adopted by the board last December. And that levy aligned with the CFC's recommendation for a 3.5% increase plus new property. We are still waiting on the county to release updated property valuations, but because the district levied less than the maximum 5% CPI, we don't expect the tax revenue budget to change much between now and September. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. So corporate personal property replacement taxes are another story entirely. These revenues can be highly variable from year to year, which makes them more difficult to predict. The revenues were at an all-time high in fiscal year 23, but the three most recent distributions we received were all significantly less than the year before. So that mini trend, if you will, combined with some other publications that have come out recently regarding the state's finances, leads me to believe that a decline is coming in fiscal year 24. So we are budgeting for a drop in this area. Interest income, on the other hand, is trending in the opposite direction. Our earnings are expected to double FY23 earnings, which is certainly a welcome sign with what we've been facing in that area for the last few years with such low interest rates. We do have a new budget line this year for donations from the Imagine Foundation in relation to Project 2. While the timing and amount to be received is uncertain, we do have $2 million built into the budget, and that figure aligns with the number we've been using in our financial projection model, as well as the most recent estimates we have from the foundation. And then lastly, we're budgeting a decrease in federal grant revenue next year. The COVID relief grants, such as the ESSER grant, are starting to approach the end of their grant period. So we're expecting federal revenue to return to funding levels pretty close to what they were prior to the pandemic. This next slide outlines the revenue budget numerically with comparisons made between the preliminary budget and the fiscal year 2023 budget. I talked about some of the significant changes on the previous slide, but I do want to point out that three of those items, mainly the CPPRT revenues, interest income, and the Imagine donations, all get grouped into this second line here called other local sources. So some of those variances that I talked about explain why this percentage change amount for that line appears so large at 33%. We've also listed some estimates for where we expect to land with fiscal year 2023 actual revenues. That's in the second column on the right. And total revenues are at this point are predicted to be 94.5 million, which would be a variance of less than 1% from what we budgeted for fiscal year 23. So those are heading pretty much right on track with what we were expecting at this time last year. And then this last slide for revenues shows the district's revenues by source in a pie chart. Again, you can see the high reliance on real estate taxes for funding, but there is a slight percentage uptick in the other local sources wedge for fiscal year 2024 because of those improved interest earnings and a new revenue source for the Imagine donations. And I'm going to pause briefly here just to see if the committee has any questions in regards to revenues.
No questions.
Okay. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about some notable expenditure items pertaining to this year's budget. Personnel makes up the largest component of a school district's budget, and fortunately, salaries for most district staff are already set at this point. The exceptions are buildings and grounds and campus safety employees whose contracts are still under negotiations. But you may remember at this time last year when we were talking about preliminary budget, it was exactly the reverse. We had 1 year remaining on our B&G and campus safety contracts, and all other employee groups were undetermined. So we do have a greater confidence level in the salaries area of the budget at this point, as opposed to a year ago. Employee benefits are sort of a mixed bag, but when examined in the aggregate, we're currently anticipating an increase of only 1% from last year's budget. Some of the increases expected for health and dental insurance costs are being held in check by pension contribution rates for IMRF and TRS that are either decreasing or staying flat in fiscal year 24. So those two forces are kind of offsetting each other a bit in terms of budget numbers. Now, the one caveat with this budget area is that health insurance costs are always difficult to forecast in the early stages of the budget. The reason being, our insurance plan year aligns with the calendar year rather than our fiscal year. So the good news with that is premiums for the first 6 months of next fiscal year are already known. But the bad news is we don't know how much those premiums are going to change as of January 1st. Because at the time we're working on this preliminary budget, we really only had about 4 months worth of claims experience on the books for 2023. So that makes guessing at this point in the game much, there's more variance possible at this stage of the game. So final premiums typically become known around October, which is after the budget is adopted, but we do work closely with our insurance advisors to monitor our claims experience, and we're hoping to have a better feel for what those increases will officially be later this summer sometime. Then in this third bullet point, this is an important one in regards to this year's budget. It has to do with purchase services, supplies, and equipment. And to kind of set the stage for this one, I want to give a quick recap of the pandemic's impact on spending in these areas. If we go back to the spring of 2020, the district was shifting to remote learning. That's when all the stay-at-home orders were coming into effect. As a result, we saw a sharp decline in spending. Some of the services that we typically need simply weren't required at that point in time, or they were needed at much lower capacities. Our supply purchases were pretty minimal because no one was in the building. And some of the program initiatives that were planned had to be put on hold as we were quickly adapting to a new educational environment. Then in 2021, there was this shift to the hybrid learning model where we had both remote and in-person learning going on simultaneously. And that brought about some additional needs. By that time, though, the federal government had come out with the COVID relief grants. So even though District 200 didn't get a huge amount of money, the grants that we were awarded did help in the sense we were able to use that funding to help satisfy some of those additional needs we had in the hybrid learning model. So again, that kind of helped our bottom line. If we fast forward to a year ago, when we were budget planning for fiscal year 23, that was our first full year that we were going to be back to in-person learning. And there was a common theme from many of our budget managers at that time that they felt significant budget increases would be needed. And they gave two main reasons. One was we had a backlog of program and operational needs that had been put on hold the previous 2 pandemic years and needed to be caught up on. And then the second was we were also experiencing higher pricing on many of the goods and services we buy because of inflation and supply chain shortages. So it kind of put a stress on this area of the budget for fiscal year 2023. If we flip over to the expenditure data and we look at the estimated actual FY 2023 column, total expenditures prior to construction is on track to be under budget by $3.5 million right now. Of that amount, $2.5 million comes from this grouping of purchase services, supplies, and equipment lines. So this trend became evident during the business office's mid-year budget review in January. And in short, it was a clear sign to us that we had been much too conservative and built in too many contingencies with the FY23 budget, and that these areas really needed to be the focal point for some changes going forward. As part of this year's budget planning, I performed a thorough review of every budget manager's request in these areas, mainly to see how was our spending looking historically, and I had to go back, multiple years, because with the pandemic falling in there, it definitely skewed things one way or another. So we have looked at a good 5-6 years worth of data, and just tried to figure out where we could tighten things up in these areas. So far, I think the additional work has yielded some positive results. If you look at this change column right in the middle of the slide, you'll see that for purchase services, supplies, and equipment in the aggregate, the budget for fiscal year 2024 is reflecting a $1.5 million reduction from the FY23 budget. So our hope is that by resetting the baseline for spending in these areas, we will narrow the gap on the spending variance that we see at this time next year. Another area to highlight on this particular slide is the total expenditures prior to capital. We have the budget for FY24 set at 86.3 million roughly. And then if you look over under the percent change column, you can see that's a 1.82% increase from the previous year's budget. Typically, we like to compare that percentage to the CPI increase from our tax levy, which, if you recall from our earlier conversation on revenues, was 3.5%. So to kind of put it in that perspective, it puts our budgeted expenditure increase well within that CPI limit that our levy increased by. Then lastly, the bottom half of the slide lays out our expected capital expenditures. These costs can vary significantly from year to year, depending on the projects we have going on. So there's not a lot of value in comparing one year to the next. However, one point I do want to make that we'll revisit again later in the presentation is the line right in the middle for the athletic fields. The budget for fiscal year 23 assumed the cost for this project would be split nearly 50-50 between fiscal years 23 and 24. It's now looking like actual expenditures for 23 will come in around between 4 and 5 million. We've got a little over 4 million right now. That means that the additional costs for this project had to be shifted to the fiscal year 24 budget and essentially budgeted for again. As a reminder, this budget for capital also includes expected costs needed to complete projects 1 and the health and life safety work. So the athletic fields fall into that same kind of grouping where our budget for fiscal year 24 is being set for costs needed to complete those 3 projects. Then we also have a budget line for project 2, which spending will be starting to get underway in fiscal year 2024. Any questions related to expenditures?
Brian, you mentioned that we would expect things to be in line with our levy increase. And which numbers were you referring to?
The one that we typically compare is the line kind of right in the middle of the slide called total expenditures before building maintenance and construction, 1.82%.
But that's a budget to budget comparison,
Yes.
not a budget to actual.
Yeah, I had the same question, and
Yeah.
when I ran the numbers, budget to actual, it's like 6%.
6.3.
increase. So then I had some questions on, I guess, the one budget line item that jumped out at me was that other objects line where 4.5 million last year, 4.5 million this year, 5.5 million next year. And just wondering what made that up.
Yeah, that line's mainly being driven by our special education tuition for outplaced students. We've had a couple years where we've been fairly fortunate, I would say, in terms of our total costs in that area. We're seeing a slight shift this year in the cost of some of those outplacements between number of students is not changing all that much, but some of the cost of their actual tuition, whether it's room and board or just tuition at the school itself, has gone up, and that's kind of pushing that increase there.
Thank you. The other one, on the salary line, budget to actual is about almost a 5.5% increase. Is that both a factor of contracts and of changes in staffing?
That one is primarily change in contracts. There is a little component of staffing in there, but most of the staffing that was added had identified offsets in other areas. The one exception, I suppose, would be the 6 new positions in the campus safety bargaining unit.
That's the area of concern that I would have when we start looking longer term. I think we're going to look at the updated 5-year projections when we have a final budget and actuals in a couple of months. But keeping that line up in line with the CPI is going to be paramount to keeping the budget balanced longer term, especially the project to debt coming out of the operating funds at some point in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the other thing that is also sort of holding down the expenses for fiscal year 2023 is some of the position vacancies we had throughout the year, where when we're setting the budget, we're assuming all positions are going to be full for the entirety of the year. But if you have a position where an employee leaves and then it remains open for 6 to 8 months or whatever, then you end up finding budget savings that way, almost kind of unintentionally.
Any other questions or comments on the expenditure piece?
Yeah, I guess the question I have is, I'm looking at the 84.7 versus the 81.1, which is the fiscal 23 of what we project versus what we budgeted. And it would be helpful to kind of get a longer term view. And I know we're coming out of a pandemic, but my recall is in the pandemic year, we grossly missed. But my recall is we're always, we are always over on our budget. We are beating our budget and beating it in some cases by significant amounts. Okay, I think we've tightened it up. I know during the pandemic we had a couple of years, but it would be good to see multiple years of what we're doing versus our budget, because what happens is if you're consistently off, then when you look at the new year, it gives you a different picture of what happens is my expectation is our fund balance change in this year that we're going to be completing is going to be favorable than what we had planned. And then the next year is going to be unfavorable, and it kind of makes it hard to follow. So it would be nice to see how well we do over an extended period of time is my question.
I actually did that exercise, pulled up the file. It was last August. I don't remember how much of it I shared with the committee. And it only would have gone through 2021.
Okay.
But that was the starting point, because I had a similar concern where I felt like historically we were conservative on both revenues and expenditures, and so each year's actuals were coming in considerably better than expected.
What did the data say?
Very small numbers, but I'm trying to remember how I did this. Let's see.
Next time we're using larger numbers.
Yeah, really. And look, I can zoom.
Oh, wow.
I think in general, my recollection in the end, we're pretty close generally on the staffing pieces, and it was the non-staffing expenditures that tended to come in considerably under on a regular basis, like double-digit percentages under, and like, given that 2021 was kind of a off year, obviously, but even looking back to 18, 19, 20, we're 15-20% on the budget on line items like purchase services or supplies. Yeah, and similar in O&M, it looks like. So I can send this to the administration and we can look to have an updated version that we can 22 and 2023.
And I think that over those years too, that's when we started tightening more with the budget. Plus, I know in 18, that's when we first started doing the zero-based budget. So it's getting everybody on track with the zero-based, then we went to everybody explaining what their expenditures are. So I think every year we're doing this, it's improving more and more. And getting us closer to the budget and what we're actually spending.
Yeah, and I think it's, the way this spreadsheet is laid out, it's a tale of two stories here. On the top, it's really just how well you're budgeting, because timing, these are perpetual expenditures. When you get into your capital, it's just a question of how much did we get into a given year, and there's sizable shifts. That's a different story. But they both are compounded when you kind of just look at the bottom line.
Brian, you want to go ahead with the next slide then?
Sure. All right, so this chart simply demonstrates the expenditures by object or type, if you want to, if you will. And it just shows the large percentage of the district's resources spent on salaries, employee benefits, and then 28% right now being devoted towards capital. So what's the impact of the budget on the district's fund balance? The top half of this slide shows the operating funds. And these are projected to have a surplus of $7.6 million for the year. But then we have transfers of $10.1 million scheduled to cover capital work, which will bring operating fund balance down to an estimated $59.6 million at the end of fiscal year 24. In terms of our fund balance policy, that equates to 69% of operating expenditures. So we all go back to that policy and our target ranges, which in the original policy was set between 25% and 75%. Committee has talked about narrowing that top end of that range down to 50%. So we're kind of in between that initial high end of the range and we're in the new one that we're heading towards. In the non-operating fund balance, we're estimating that we'll end the year at $6.3 million. Almost all of that consists of reserves in the capital projects fund. So the $10.1 million transfer that I referenced is meant to cover all of fiscal year 24's capital expenditures and leave enough in reserve for the following year's 10-year maintenance plan work. And that's also without touching any of the $2 million of Imagine Foundation donations. Now, the reason for that is, with it being the first year of us scheduled to receive donations, we wanted to be covered in case those donations end up being less than expected. That way we know we're good. We have enough money there for our scheduled 10-year maintenance work, and whatever comes in for the donations can then be applied towards project 2 in subsequent years. The way the budget is set up also assumes that the debt certificates that are part of the project 2 funding plan will not be issued until fiscal year 2025. So those are not built into this year's budget in any way. Here is that chart that we often show displaying operating fund balance in relation to the high and low ends of our fund balance target. The red line and the green lines are typically in the chart each time. That's the 25% and 75% of expenditures. And then you'll see I've also added the blue line in the middle of this year, which signifies 50% of operating expenditures. So the committee's proposed revision to our fund balance policy would drop the top end of that range down to where the blue line is. You'll notice fund balance continues to steadily decline as a result of the district funding its capital projects from reserves. If the assumptions from our financial projection model hold, this fund balance bar will end up dropping within that 25 to 50% range by no later than fiscal year 27. So another part of our preliminary budget analysis is doing a comparison to the 5-year financial projection, which in our case was last updated in March when we were considering some of the financing options for Project 2. In reviewing that comparison, there were 5 variances that I felt warranted some additional discussion. I'm going to move forward to the next slide so you can see actual numbers while I talk about each of them. I think it'll help visualize better on the numbers side. So here you see the side-by-side comparison for our operating funds. The first variance pertains to the timing of interest income. So in this case, we're looking at this line at the very top of the slide called total revenues. In our projection model, we made an assumption that any new investments we purchased towards the end of fiscal year 2023 would be government securities, which pay interest coupons every 6 months. Recently, in working with our investment advisor, our most recent set of investment purchases were recommended to be term series investments because they were offering more favorable interest rates. Because those investments pay interest at maturity, we had about a $500,000 variance of interest income that was initially projected for fiscal year 24 and is now being shifted out one more year to fiscal year 25. Aside from that timing difference, total revenues are right in line with the projection model from last March. Then the next section shows expenditures, and there are 2 items I want to mention here. I talked earlier about some of the fine tuning we did within the budget for purchase services and supplies. Back when the financial projections were developed, we believed we could lower the budget in those areas by 1.2 million. So the projection model did include that reduction already. If you look at the change column for those lines, you'll see that we were actually able to decrease it by an additional 300,000. And the reason the decrease appears only on the supplies line is because we've made an accounting adjustment internally to move expenses for some web-based software programs and licenses out of the supplies line and into the purchase services line. Now that's being done per the state's school accounting guidelines. And I only point that out because if you were looking at these numbers prior to that adjustment occurring, you would actually see decreases in both purchase services and supplies. But it is being forcibly, the adjustment is being forcibly pushed more down towards supplies because of that accounting change. The other expenditure variance we talked about in relation to Steve's question, and that's the other objects line going up 500,000. The reason for that variance again is we're currently budgeting for a larger increase in special education tuition. We are still waiting on some student placements and tuition rates to be finalized from those outplaced schools. So that number is definitely subject to change between now and the next version of the budget. But we did want to be a little bit more conservative with that number for now. So that's why you see that increase there. After totaling everything up, the variance on the total expenditures line is less than 1% from the projection model. Next, we have the transfers section. When the financial projections were prepared for the project 2 scenarios, to keep things simple, we had dropped all project 2 expenses into fiscal years 25, 26, and 27. And that was to kind of help us with that apples to apples comparison when we had 5 different scenarios we were looking at. With the board's selection of the debt certificates financing model, that means that some construction expenses for project 2 can be expected in fiscal year 2024. The majority of that is architectural work, but by May or June, we do have some estimates for actual construction work starting to work its way into fiscal year 2024. So since we are shifting the timing of those expenses, we also need to transfer money from the operating funds to the capital projects fund earlier to cover them. So that's the 6.4 million you'll see on the line labeled transfers for project 2. And just to reiterate, that amount was not in the projection model for fiscal year 24 because it was part of a larger transfer scheduled in fiscal year 2025. So it's simply, again, it's a timing difference between 2 fiscal years. So where does that leave us? At the bottom of the slide, you'll notice the preliminary budget indicates we'll finish the year with 59.6 million of fund balance. That's 2.7 million less than the projection. Now, we just talked about the timing difference of the 6.4 million transfer for project 2. So that's pushing our fiscal year 24 fund balance lower than the model, at least temporarily. So why isn't fund balance lower by 6.4 million? That's kind of the next logical question. And it's because of something we already kind of talked about. Our expenditures are running under budget this year. We're estimating we'll be starting fiscal year 24 with an operating fund balance that is $2.3 million higher than where we thought we'd be at the end of fiscal year 23, according to the budget. I want to stress the importance of that point in this comparison. At first glance, seeing a lower fund balance to expenditure ratio than the projection model might be a cause for concern. However, if you can kind of block out the noise from some of the various timing differences we've discussed, the underspend in fiscal year 23 actually has us in a more favorable position long-term than predicted by the projection model. I think when we do update the financial projections in August, you'll see that playing out more so in the numbers. So I know I covered a lot of information on this particular slide. I just wanted to check again and see if there were any questions in regards to the comparison between budget and financial projection before I wrap things up.
Doesn't look like there's any.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've addressed it. I mean, to me, it becomes multi-year look, because when you're moving $6 million, you're moving big chunks of dollars one year to the other, it is a timing issue. You know, my never-ending question I'm gonna ask is, how are we doing versus the projection model that we use to make strategic decisions on? And really not on an individual year basis, but over the long, over the long term of that. So that sounds like something we'll be seeing in August, that we'll look at 25 and beyond. So to just validate that we're staying the course.
Right. Okay. So in comparing the budget for non-operating funds to the projection, the notable variances here are again due to timing. On the revenue side, we had a $500,000 state grant that we expected to receive this year that has been delayed until fiscal year 24. So we've budgeted for that again in fiscal year 24. For expenditures, the increase is due to project 2 and the athletic fields, which we already discussed earlier. So in project 2's case, some expenditures are being accelerated by a year from the projection model. With the athletic fields, we spent less this year than expected, So those costs needed to complete the project have been added to the fiscal year 2024 budget. As is the case with any preliminary budget, there are always some unknowns. This list highlights the areas where the budget is most likely to change between now and September. I've already touched on all of these in other parts of the presentation, so I won't go through them all again, but I did include them here merely as a reminder of some of the things that are on our radar for further review. When future versions of the budget are prepared, we always make sure to include a list of significant changes for the board's review. One of them that I think I can almost guarantee will result in some changes is that second bullet from the bottom, project 2. As we currently, our project 2 cost estimates are being made internally with some help from our architects. Once we get our construction manager on board, that'll be one of the first things that we as a business office are talking to them about is looking towards help with projecting when the expenses for that project will occur. Because when you're talking about a multi-year project, we're trying to be as accurate as we can in terms of how much will occur year by year to help us from a budgeting standpoint. And then lastly, this slide just summarizes the overall timeline for the budget process. So the tentative budget will be brought to the board in August at the committee of the whole meeting, and then final adoption will occur in late September. And then I'll open it back up to the committee for any additional questions or discussion.
Thank you, Brian. Any other questions or comments for the preliminary budget? Our next agenda item was enrollment forecast. This was something in planning the meeting I thought would be helpful as a packet item. We're not going to review the whole slide deck. It's very exhaustive. I have not seen the work of this firm before, but this is pretty enrollment projections have come away since I last looked at one where it was just columns of numbers. But I would like to kind of hear from the administration and from the board's perspective, just sort of what your big takeaways are from it, how it affects short and longer term planning, and especially as it affects financial needs and such in the district.
So, one of the takeaways have been the fact that we see a decrease going on in the enrollment of students over the next 5 years. So by saying that, one thing that you would be looking at is when we're hiring FTE, what is the need at that point in time? What do we offer? And adjusting our budgets, and also, again, what our need for adding additional FTE if we need them, especially when you see a decrease. Again, this is something that usually comes out as a projection. I know when I looked at it, I did a little bit of a comparison from the last time we did this to here, and it looked like the numbers had dropped some. We also look at it coming out of COVID, our numbers dropped and then they started to come back up a little. So that's the anticipation a little bit, is we may still see a couple of adjustments over the next, I'd say 2 or 3 years.
I forget the timing of when this was released, but did the last set of 5-year projections we looked at include these numbers, declining enrollments and potentially reduced staffing? Or
no, actually it showed that we were increasing and then sort of going flat and maybe just a little bit of a decrease. Normally we would have this done sooner, but we need to get some of the information extracted from technology. So they had to work together because of the information that could be released and how it was being released.
So, yeah, this is definitely the first set of data I've seen in a decade that shows a downward trend.
Yeah.
When you know, the big picture is 10 years ago, the projections that we had. So timeframe 2013-ish, we're predicting a sizable increase up to 4,000 students in the 2018-2019 realm, which never materialized. So that was an overly you know, inflated that didn't materialize for whatever the reason. We ended up peaking, you know, it's been fairly constant, peaking in the 3,400 to 3,500 number range. But prior projections to this showed it kind of peaking and plateauing at that level. This is the first time I can recall, you know, that's a 10% decline in student population, so or enrollment, which is a major shift in what we've been seeing.
And it's pretty clear when you look at the details that there's a lot fewer kids in the early grades in the Peter district. So unless we see a dramatic turnover in the housing stock, it seems fairly likely that.
Just question on that, because I know the data kind of feeds off of the K-3 districts a lot. Just anecdotally, I can't say or deny it's gonna actually happen, but the last, the K-3 for 97, the last 2 years it decreased, but it's because a lot of people took their kids out and put them in other schools temporarily. But I feel like they might come back for high school. How much, I don't know, how much of that data known to, my thought is the decrease actually might not be as significant when those kids come to high school. I feel like they'll come back to the high school, they left. I mean, some will stay out, but I feel like a lot, I know a lot of kids have actually been taken out for middle school and they come back for high school because the middle schools just don't like them.
My experience has been in working with other districts over the years, that it's really hard to get data from private schools and parochial schools. And it'd be great if we could find out, how many kids in those Oak Park schools live in Oak Park or River Forest, and then you could see some of that maybe matriculation history and current, but I'm not sure we'd be able to get it. But yeah, it's certainly valid. I know some families that did that during COVID because they worked in healthcare, the kids needed to be in school because they were going to be at work, and they've already made the move back to D97, rather than keeping it in a private school all the way through grade.
Yeah. And what would be interesting is the slide you guys are both looking at, my screen's not working.
That's how we're gonna.
You're saying mine are 33.
You're better than me.
I'm just 33.
I'm stressed.
What are you asking for number?
Yeah, page 30, there you go.
No, it's.
That one?
Yeah.
So the comparison is, that's the student count, and then what's our staff count? As you look at that over the same period of time. Because there was in the 13, 14, 15 timeframe, when we had an enrollment projection that was showing, when we were seeing some increase, we were, and an enrollment projection that was at 37, 38, 39. I'll tell you, the staffing went from an increase by 100, which is 20% over that period of time.
You could just see from the chart that we never been that close. It's like it's somewhere between 34, 35, close.
I'm talking about our staffing then.
Oh, staff.
I'm saying our staffing.
Yeah, I thought it was.
So, I mean, we added a significant resource in some cases, because of enrollment, in some cases for, other needs and supports. And an exercise to consider then is using the evidence-based funding model, right? Because that has in it a student count. So if you took and just said, we know what we're spending, right? And, and we know what our resources are, our head count is in terms of staff. Change the enrollment to match what the projection is, and it will tell you if we do nothing, what will happen to our adequacy level. I mean, that's a math exercise. I would say that if we do nothing, then and our student population declines by 10%, then our adequacy level would go up by, mathematically 10%. So
my recollection from the last meeting was that on an FTE basis, our classroom teachers were really close to the EBF amount based on the district's demographics. Salary, dollar amount wise, we were over because average salaries are much higher than the state average, even with the wage index. But FTE was really close to what EBF said should be added for
classroom team.
the classroom.
Yeah. For other areas, there's so that will. Because that will adjust, coming back to your question earlier, which is, as we're making now decisions to the future. How do we use this data in terms of making those decisions so that we can control it and not be sitting there bloated and then you say, oh, we can't do anything. And with this, if I'm, in the demographic report, our student count is expected to be declining, but our tax base, we're not losing 10% of the tax revenue or the households, et cetera. So, is there anything in there that we would expect to be changing based on that? I think I saw really tweaks. We don't have a lot of new construction, and there's not a lot of place to do it. So
A considerable amount of construction in Oak Park, isn't it? New apartments and new condos. I don't know if it's not a large percentage, but
And nothing as big a scale as what we saw 5 years ago with
Right.
high rises
Right.
downtown, but there are some smaller scale ones that were in the report. It was interesting to see the numbers of kids coming from the multifamily. I don't think I know how small that is.
So I guess the big picture question is, how do we take this data right here and, put it, look at it and factor it into kind of our longer term financial planning to say, what does it mean? I think from a district standpoint, the positive is, when we were in a situation of increased enrollment, that usually means you need more resources to do things and you don't have any more tax dollars to do it. That's the downside. This one shows the opposite kind of dynamics. And so, or how do we treat that? What do we do?
It's been a while since the district had to do any shrinking of staff, I think, so it's definitely conversations the board and
Yeah.
administration will need to have on what is that process and how do you minimize the impact on kids and do it through attrition as most as you can.
I just wanted to say, unfortunately, from these numbers, we don't know like how the students were coming in, how many will be special education. And like you saw in the preliminary budget before, like how much we spent on those cases when we have to autoplay them. So that's so out of these, that number of special education students could be significantly higher than what it is, and that it would kind of, offset the decrease in the number of students. So we always have to have a cushion for that.
Yeah. There are several steps in the process between, an enrollment, and everybody knows this, I'm just pointing out the obvious.
several steps between an enrollment projection and type of which we see here. And an understanding of exactly what that means for staffing for a given year. We have that whole, master schedule development process every school year, which we've tightened up quite a bit. To make sure that we're sticking to solid protocols for which classes will run and which classes don't run. So that we just don't run classes with really low numbers, because historically we've done so and it feels good to do so again. So we've tightened that process up pretty effectively over the past few years, and that will help us to ensure that the staffing numbers that we have been recommending, we will continue to recommend, are improved with student needs. We'd be prepared to make hard decisions based off of really those numbers that I was just describing. When we go through the registration, the enrollment process every school year, build our master schedule. What are we looking at that point? Because those are kids who have actively expressed that I'm going to be here and I will be taking classes, the following school year. So
Yeah, but we're talking, I clearly understand that the day of, when you make decision, you make it based on that year, okay? There were decisions made that were kind of, oh, we're going this way, we need, it can't be it has to be a two-way street, okay?
I didn't follow the first part. There are decisions made that were going to, is that what we?
Right, yes, every year you got, decisions on what you need for staff are based on what the actual enrollment is.
Absolutely.
This is more just to begin thinking, right, and forward planning from my perspective. So, I mean, is there an opportunity at this to reduce the amount of money we need to borrow, right? I mean, that we're,
Yes.
Those are just. Pardon?
Yes. But the thing is, you just play the ranges. So like in 2013, they said 4,000 people, so you guys started planning for 4,000 people. Looking at every year right here, they've all been wrong. Every time they do it, they're wrong. It's a forecast, and that's fine. But you were planning for 4,000 people, and you weren't even at 3,500. So now we're at 3,316, and we think it's going to go down 3,000 over the next few years. Do we have to plan for it to go down? No, just give yourself a range. That's 600 students a year. If enrollment goes down between, say, 350 and 800, then you start planning for the next year. And the next year, wherever it is, it spikes up, then you've already planned for it. You just got to give yourself a range for it. But you can't do like 13, where some guy said you guys are going to have 4,000 people here in 5 years, because that never happened. You didn't even come close to it. So I think it's just more tweaking, as opposed to you're like you say, you're tweaking every year, as opposed to forecasting going, we're going to lose 3,000 students over the next, you don't need to be in the meeting next month going 3,000 students over the next 5 years. We got to start like,
It's gonna be a high school of 400 kids.
we got to start like getting rid of people and stuff like that. You can't really do that. You just have to kind of stay in a range and say, okay, this is what our FTE is going to do this year or that year or something like that.
Let's illustrate the actual variance that we see here in terms of FTE. That's a simple calculation that we can estimate right now. So take a look at 22-23 school year versus 23-24 school year. That's a decrease of 35 students. If I've quickly done that math correctly, and I have, right? At 35 students, that's one class, that's 0.2 FTE. It's a 0.2 FTE difference, right? That's one class period, assuming it runs, or maybe 5, right? Depending on how big our class sizes are. Anybody listening at home, I just did not make a declarative statement about 36 students in one class per class. All right, but then you keep doing that across the board. The biggest variance that I think we see here is between 24-25 and 25-26 school year. That's 76 and 11, that's 87 students. So that's, 3 to 4 class size, that's 0.8, so when you figure average class sizes across the board. So that's 0.8 is less than a teacher, right? It's almost a full teacher FTE. So this is the type of year to year kind of micro decision making that this forecast encourages us to make. And these are the types of things that could be very natural products of the master scheduling process that I'm talking about. I'm talking about huge swings, where,
The math's not working for me.
Okay.
Isn't it 35 kids that aren't there every period of the day, and so wouldn't it be a 1.0 and change?
35 kids.
across?
Multiple classes.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of support.
Well done complicating my math.
What others, that's what it is. So we're okay. We're okay. What else we learned is don't live in an English teacher in math. That's exactly right.
But I quickly did that arithmetic. I just.
You did that, that was correct.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right about that. You're right about that. It's multiplied over all the classes.
If I just may add to this, that, you know, we're very close to India, as we mentioned here, I think mentioned it, as far as classroom activity goes. And I would argue that really the student enrollment is the best predict, it helps us to define like what the classroom positions should be and support, direct support to students. But other positions, like for instance, we added 2 custodian positions, right? That is not directly related to the number of students, but rather to this, what the square footage of the building is. And so like having fewer students wouldn't necessarily mean that we would need to reduce custodians. And I'm just giving one example, but other position where we say that we're, according to EDF, we're higher than we should be. It's a combination of factors. It's not just the student.
Anything else on the enrollment forecast?
Just to follow that up and correct that. So 30, we talked about 30 students switch. And we're stuck on it now. That's 7 periods a day. It's 210. That's how you calculate that out. This kids take 7 periods a day. Lunch doesn't count. So that is a much more significant event. That's 9 sections of classes or something like that. Okay, thank you. I'm good.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great. Then the last agenda item was just an update on what's happening out in the fields. I've been driving by them a lot the last month or 2 and seeing lots of dirt moving around, and thought it'd be good for us to get an update on what's happening, when you're expecting to have things completed. and
Yeah, so
like that.
we are on, so we're on track with timelines for the projects. We are on track, pun intended. We're on track with the project, and we're really thrilled to see it going along as it is. So the anticipated finish date for the west field that the track is going to be on is late October. The Lake Street field is, you already see a ton of progress over there. The netting is up, the lights are up over there. We also have the light poles up around each side of the tennis courts as well. Not with that has at least on the say the poles have gone up over there, which is good to see. And the Lake Street field is slated to be done August 4th, so that is pretty soon. And the idea is that will be ready for use in the fall semester. And it's at that point when we're into the fall semester that the other work over at Bridge and Common is October 16th and on 11/10. There's not a whole lot to say from a financial perspective. Just looking at our SAM fees, we have from their end, just pure construction costs. It's a $14.1 million project for them, and we're only talking about just under $2 million of that work coming in at this point. So we're in the early stages of being able to talk about how much that is already costing us, but there's nothing there that has shifted our expenses in a big way, right? There have been no unexpected costs throughout the project.
Quick question from a community use standpoint, will this track be available for community use outside of practice and meet time like the Southfield one used to be? I know it would get a fair amount of use.
Yep, that's something we had talked about in the early days with the community meetings and our initial communications. Not during the school day, of course, and when it's used, and also not during any other practice times. But other than that, just like a good model of that would be our tennis courts, just like our tennis courts.
Any questions on construction in progress?
So it's on budget.
It's on budget, it's on time.
So then I think we're looking at in August next meeting, can we put the slide from the budget calendar? Or I can just put it here. So, August 10th is when it goes to the board.
So you want to do the 14th.
So you want to do sometime after that, probably, right?
You'd want to do it after the 10th, but before, it's somewhere between the 14th and the 18th of August. So it would be the week prior to the board meeting.
Between Wednesday and Wednesday.
Yeah, the 14th and 18th, because the cow is the 10th, the regular board meeting is the 24th.
Okay, so, we will plan on finding the best day that week. We'll look at updated projections. Any other agenda items that committee members want to put on the radar for administrative team? Maybe the staffing history that you were talking about. Some of that to compare to the enrollment history as we're looking forward. I think that would be helpful. I think it's something we talked about a little bit at the last meeting when we were talking about EDF. I know there's some of that like in the Capper document. We got like a 10-year book back there, so maybe we just include that piece in the packet. Anything else? Anything on your radar?
In terms of financing,
Yeah, I was just
that I heard fiscal 25 is when debt certificates would begin to be in play. Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
it's not in the budget, right? So it's probably premature.
So
to-
we're early there. Yeah, that's why I was saying this enrollment and other discussions is, those are all lead-ins into how much do you need to borrow? You're gonna take all the crystal balls you have and put them together to make that. So, but that's, I think we're premature for that.
One of the things that the committee's charge that we haven't really gotten to in our first year and almost a half here is the investment stuff. Maybe when things are a little slower and otherwise maybe that's the time to review that. I know our previous incarnation of the committee had PMA come out and present to us about it, but that's pre-COVID, so.
Yeah, and you even mentioned a change in our investment, in terms of what we're doing. So maybe that would be helpful.
Yeah, so maybe check.
Sure.
If we want to bring them out or whoever you're working with, that might be something to do with that I was saying too. So really, we have a 5-year plan update and investment.
And then also the budget update too. at that time.
Right, yeah, I mean, it's really more, what's changed between preliminary and tentative can be a single slide and then what do the numbers look like in the new projections.
So that's a short, the budget one should be.
Sounds good, Lisa will help us lock in the date. We'll go from there. I have one motion to adjourn.
Motion. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Yeah.